Bum, 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 dum, doo, doo. Da, 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 da. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Welcome, Canada. Welcome, America, but mostly welcome, Canada. Nice to see everybody. Today, my name is Dean, and I'm kind of flying solo today. This is a Canadiana podcast. What we like to do is we like to bring really important, very smart Canadians into this because I may be Canadian, but I am not a smart Canadian. To answer questions, talk about things, get to the bottom of issues that people seem to have a tough time sussing through. And what we like to do with government business is we like to make it really hard on people to understand things, specifically when it comes to something that is bad for Canadians, Bill C-18, Bill C-11. Those are two really, really difficult bills to understand. Now, what we do here at Crier Media and at crier.co, what we do here on this podcast is we create content. There are millions of Canadians that do that on a daily basis for themselves, for other people that aren't sanctioned or maybe not part of a news or specific MSM ecosystem that are about to get a very, very rude awakening thanks to the Liberal government with Bill C-18 and Bill C-11. Freedom of speech is at stake, specifically online. Privacy is at stake online. And it's about to get a whole bunch worse here in Canada. For those of you who like to hold hands with people who know what's going on, please welcome to the program with me today, professor at Ottawa University. He knows more about this than anybody else. Please welcome back to the program, Dr. and Professor Michael Geist, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you. We spend a lot of time in our basements, don't we? Like, it's like the only time I ever see you is when you're in your basement.
That is pretty much
mine.
Yeah. My kids say the same thing.
Do they really? Do they bug you about spending a lot of time in the basement?
Yeah, it's kind of par for the course, it seems, especially in this. Well, it's not COVID anymore, but ever since that, yeah.
It's weird, like you talk to people that do this job, right? And like if you're a content producer, a producer of content, you spend a lot of time curating content, editing content, writing content. And you as a professor, you spend a lot of time reading about content, learning about content, and then disseminating the content. How many hours a day are you in front of a computer reading, writing, or informing people, do you think? What do you got at? What are you clocking in at? What's your screen time?
Well, so you do get that every Sunday morning from Apple, and it tends to always sort of increase my blood pressure on a Sunday morning when I see that it's up again. But it's frankly it's way too much. So much so that I've been getting some physio, because physio actually tells me that I was having I'm not even joking. I was having some neck issues, and they're saying you're spending too much time in a particular position on Zoom meetings or in front of a screen. So.
Yeah. Is it me too? I went to a chiropractor. I'm like, my back and my lower back, my neck, and he's like, "You're doing a lot of this." And I'm like,
exactly.
He goes, "You're in front of a computer?" I go, "Yeah." Screen time last week was 16.1 hours. Is that bad? Yeah. He's like, "It's not great for you." Yeah. What does that say when we get to the age two? Is it say that we've arrived when we get like relaxing work injuries? Does it say we've made it?
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's not getting any better. I could tell you that, unfortunately.
No, it isn't. And appreciate you being here too. Real quick, I was going over. Have you read your Wikipedia page, by the way?
I at some point in time I have, but I have not in a very long time. So
they like you a lot.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And for those of you that haven't, Michael Geist is a Canadian academic and Canadian research chair in internet and e-commerce law at the University of Ottawa, member of the Centre for Law, Technology and Society, educated at the University of Western Ontario, Osgoode Hall Law School, where he received his Bachelor of Laws, Cambridge University, where he received a Master of Laws, and Columbia Law School, where he receives his Masters of Laws and Doctor of Law degree, visiting professor at universities around the world, including University of Haifa, Hong Kong University, Tel Aviv University, also senior fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation. Sorry, I'm boring you with your credentials, but there's a little more here. Michael Geist is the editor of many books, including Law, Privacy, Surveillance in Canada in the Post-Snowden Era. That was from 2015. Copyright Pentology, How the Supreme Court of Canada Shook the Foundations of Canadian Copyright Law. That was in 2013. Radical Extremism to Balance Copyright, Canadian Copyright and the Digital Agenda, 2010. You know what you're talking about. What I'm trying to do is establish some very serious parameters that we have the right person on the phone to talk about what's going on with Bill C-18 and Bill C-11. If you go to michaelgeist.ca, it's your website. Law Bites is a tremendous podcast. I would highly encourage everybody to go and download that. I would highly encourage everybody to go to michaelgeist.ca as well. Where do you want to start? Because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to lean on you to educate people as to what's going on with these two bills that the liberal government isn't just ramming down our throats. They are, and I hate to use the word, dictatorially pushing some very, very, very dangerous new bills into the atmosphere for Canadians who like the freedom of speech, love to create content. And it's scary. I haven't been very scared by this government for a long time. Some of the stuff that they're doing is very, very scary. So, C-11, let's just lay a little groundwork about C-11 and then we'll get to C-18 because C-11 scares the shit out of people like me, Dr. Geist.
Okay. All right. So there's thanks for that nice intro.
You're
I think
welcome.
my mom may have written that Wikipedia page. So anyway, so she'll be pretty happy that you.
No, dude, it's important to establish we have the guy on. You're the guy.
All right, there you go. All right, I got it. Okay, so C-11 is probably a good place to start because as between the two bills, it's the one that it's more likely that some of your listeners may be familiar with, in part because it's a piece of legislation that has been the subject of debate and no shortage of controversy now, really for several years. It was originally called Bill C-10, that it died when we had an election year and a half ago, and then was brought back as Bill C-11. And it's in all likelihood at its end stage now, but it's been an interesting process. It started life as a bill that was supposed to be about bringing in large streaming services like Netflix and Disney into the Canadian system, the broadcast system. And the idea was that the CTVs of the world are required to make contributions. The argument was they wanted to ensure that Netflix and Disney and Amazon Prime did as well. And had they stuck just with that, I think there could be a reasonable debate about what it means to create CanCon. We had a whole series of Canadian winners at the Oscars this past weekend. None of their films were actually certified CanCon, and so this notion that somehow it has to be certified, I think, could spark a really good debate. But but the bill went beyond that, and it became controversial less because of some of these mandates for the large streamers, and far more because it was expanded to include user content, TikTokers and YouTubers and podcasters and a whole range of different people who are creating, as you say, content, creating that content, posting it on any number of different platforms. And while the government initially said that they were out, they ultimately then put them back in. Where it's non-commercial content, I think they're still excluded, but commercial content, and that is a very broadly defined term. TikTok, for example, says that any TikTok that includes music would be captured by this, is all wrapped into the legislation. And I should say that it's not that the government will decide specifically what someone can say. And so when I appeared before the Senate committee, I had a chance to appear before both the Senate and the House on this. I said, it's not that the government will determine what people can say, but it will influence people's ability to be heard. And that's because it will vest powers in the broadcast regulator, the CRTC, to engage in something known as discoverability, platforms to increase the exposure of Canadian content, specifically defined Canadian content, which may well exclude some of that user content, which could have the effect in Canada of actually downgrading Canadian digital creators who may not qualify, and globally could have even more harm as they go even further down in the algorithm when people in Canada get presented potentially with some of this content and don't click on it. So there were a lot of concerns with it, and I'll just give you one last bit, and then we can engage in some questions. The government has consistently said, no, not an issue. But yet experts have identified an issue. The companies, certainly the creators, the former head of the CRTC repeatedly acknowledged this was a reality, so much so that it convinced the Senate. And so this bill ultimately goes to the Senate. You get a whole series of independent senators say, yeah, there's a problem here. The bill is not doing what the government said it would be doing. And so they created or crafted an amendment to clearly exclude users from the bill, but still do what the government said what it wanted to do, which was to ensure in particular that sound recordings, if they appeared on, say, Spotify or on YouTube, would be treated in an equivalent fashion. So that amendment did its job. It gets approved by the Senate, but just in the last couple of weeks, it comes back to the House of Commons, and the Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez says, I'm not going to accept that amendment. At times, he calls it a loophole, which is just frankly wrong. But in his official response, I think he provides a clear reasoning for why he's doing this, because he wants the power to regulate. Talks about potential technological change in the future, and the government wants that power. And so, if we're concerned about the government engaging in the potential regulation of user content, I think we've now got a case in Bill C-11 where the government's actually made fairly explicit that they are prepared to reject any attempt to carve that kind of content out, and in fact want to ensure that they've got the power to do it.
Yeah. To your point, National Post had an article about it. No stranger to taking a huge crap on anything the liberals do, which is fine, because this aligns with what you're saying. And what you're saying is that the Senate tried to put some amendments into C-11, the government, to say, hey, listen, you cannot regulate people's podcasts and their TikTok account, right? And they're saying, well, we're not. And we'll put these amendments in there so we specifically know that you won't be doing that. The amendments go into C-11 from the Senate. It gets kicked back to the House, and they're like, yeah, by the way, in this article, by the way, we're not doing any of that. Stick it. Is that essentially what you're saying? Is that's this article? That's this amendment? Is that they basically said we have no interest in changing this bill because we absolutely want the power, not just now, but down the road, to regulate anything we want on the internet.
I think that's true. It's interesting. Rodriguez appeared before an industry conference just before sort of releasing their decision, and at the time he made pretty clear that he simply wasn't interested in any substantive amendments. Said anything that really changes the bill, he's not going to approve, which I have to say is itself not just disrespectful to Senate. There's plenty of people who are disrespectful to Senate, but the hypocrisy of having a minister on the one hand acknowledge that the Senate hearings was actually the most detailed set of hearings that they said had ever been conducted on a piece of legislation, full stop. They did the work that, frankly, the House of Commons should have done, where they brought many different creators and other stakeholders who hadn't been given a chance to speak out, the chance to speak out. They went through a whole series of amendments, not in a rushed way, the way that they did in the House, but actually debated them. And they came up with pretty thoughtful amendments. I didn't agree with all of them, but nevertheless, it was a legit process, to be sure. And
was the user generated
this out?
Yeah, well, that's my question. Oh no, my bad. I interrupted you. Was the user generated stuff like YouTube, TikTok, was that in the amendment that the Senate sent back? And they're like, hey, listen, you got to take people that do podcasts that are not part of your ecosystem. You got to take them out of that bill. You cannot regulate people's social media accounts or their YouTube accounts. Oh, did we freeze?
Yeah, there was there, and so
yeah,
okay.
Oh no, you're back. You're good.
Okay,
you look great.
Good stuff. All right, okay,
Yeah.
Keep going. Sorry, I did see that. I'm gonna just try to improve things.
No, dude, we're never gonna get it right. The tech, you see, we should be able to sue the government for this kind of terrible Wi-Fi that we have in this country.
Okay. Yeah, no, we'll try to go with Ethernet instead. So yes, it did. And in fact, interestingly, the amendment was proposed by two independent senators who were both appointed by Justin Trudeau, one from Alberta, one from Quebec, Senator Paula Simons and Senator Julie Maville-Duchesne, neither of whom would be mistaken for apologists for big tech or anything like that. And the fact that it brought together the sort of, English-speaking Canada, French-speaking Canada in an amendment where they both were convinced there was something that needed fixing, and then it gets approved by the Senate as a whole, it highlights that there was simply a convincing case made. You had people saying, listen, this is a real problem. And in fact, the minister did appear for that committee. They weren't convinced with what the minister had to say. They heard from enough experts and others to be convinced that there was a problem. They put that amendment in. And honestly, it provided just this easy off-ramp for this entire controversy. And that's in some ways what's so puzzling. This has been an issue that has caused a great deal of concern for hundreds or thousands of creators, digital creators in Canada, for podcasters, for YouTubers, for TikTokers, and for any number of other people who, value freedom of expression, are concerned about some of the implications of this legislation. And they had an easy off ramp that addressed the issue, that still addressed the specific use case that the minister had raised. He often talks about, if the weekend, a song from the weekend plays on Spotify, it should be treated in the same way on YouTube. And there are ensured that that was still, as I say, initially basically saying he wanted to ensure that he had the ongoing power to regulate. And then now, in subsequent discussion, describing it as a loophole. And as I wrote in one post, digital creators are not loopholes. Podcasters are not loopholes. And the indigenous creators that appeared before committee, the kids content creators that appeared before committee, the comedians that appeared before committee, they were all different sorts of people from all walks of life that took the time to appear before committee. They're not loopholes. They're not people that you get to say, you know what, your concerns are simply unimportant and I'm just going to reject them altogether. Yet that's precisely what the government is doing here.
Yeah, with C-11 is that bill. It's that bill that says, "Hey, listen, we need to regulate what's going on online," and there are a bunch of different impetuses, and and here's the crazy part is I'm kind of sensitive to the impetus of regulation in the time that we live in, right? Like, because we do this content and it's a daily thing, and we go into those areas where there's a lot of conflict, and people really do abuse the privilege of being able to be on some of these platforms in a post-truth world. Part of me now thinks differently, right? Where I think, okay, there's got to be some regulation. Like I look at Rebel News, I look at True North, I look at a couple of other derelict outlets like Canada Proud, and I think to myself, the truth needs to be a baseline for some type of regulation. And in regulation, you find that there sometimes, specifically in mainstream media, there are triggers in those regulations to say, okay, if that happens and this happens, that happens and this happens. The internet has been the Wild West for as long as the internet has been around, right? And so there's a sensitivity and a part of me that says, okay, and I'm just speaking freely here because I hate both bills, and we'll get to C-18 in just a second. But to that point, from the landscape that we see, the abuse of privilege to be on some of these platforms in a post-truth world, not just the freedom of speech and the ability to say whatever we want, and the maintenance of that free speech, but is there not, in your mind, some regulation that might need to happen in terms of digital content? Is there not something that we should be doing as a country? Because it seems like, especially just with C-11, it seems like there are parts involved in C-11 or pieces in C-11 that are trying to do just that, which is like, holy shit, we've just gone through, disinformation, misinformation, circus city, and we need to do something about it because it's causing mental, physical health issues for people that don't have the power or the ability to reason, through what they see and what they pick up on Facebook, what they pick up on YouTube, podcasts from bad actors, bad messaging and fake news from bad actors. Is that not part of this, or is that the part they're not saying out loud? And am I way off? Like, I struggle with C-11 in that regard because I hate it in terms of like people are going to have the ability to tell people like you and me what to do when we've never had that issue here, right? Other than platforms like YouTube saying, strike here, you can't do that, we're going to demonetize you, which is all fugazi anyway because you have no idea what those triggers are there. But is there not an argument to be made for some type of regulation? And if there is any of that in C-11, or am I way off?
No, I don't think you're way off. I think there's a few things to say. First off, opposing C-11, or when we get to it, C-18, is not about opposing regulation of technology companies over the internet and the like. I mean, that's the game that the liberals and the government want to play, where anytime you express concern about this legislation, they say, well, you're just an apologist for big tech, or you're just opposed to any sort of regulation, or they're opposed to any sort of regulation. And they may well be opposed to uh, certainly this regulation and other kinds of regulation. But I don't think many of the people that are raising concerns with the legislation are saying no to regulation altogether. They're saying no to bad regulation. And this, in this case, is bad regulation. In fact, it seems to me that there are things that certainly I support and a lot of other people would support that I wish the government would prioritize. I wish the government would prioritize our personal information, privacy, and ensure that we've got better privacy and data governance rules in Canada. And yet that hasn't been a priority for the government. I mean, that's in some ways the secret sauce for a lot of these companies. That gives them a lot of their market advantage is the amount of data that they have. And yet we have been very slow to move when it comes to privacy. In fact, there's been legislation that dates back just about as long as C-11, which barely moves because the government doesn't prioritize it to try to modernize and enhance some of our privacy protections. We
Why
could
not?
ensure that we've got strong rules on anti-competitive behavior. And again,
Mm.
if these companies are violating or abusing their position in the marketplace, well, of course we targeting that. But again, it hasn't been a big priority. Instead, and the way I've been saying it to some people is the government almost wants to treat these companies like a policy ATM. And they're just looking for cash withdrawals for the policy measures that they like. And so in some ways, it's almost about profiting from these companies. So it's let's profit from, I mean, this is the classic example that makes my head spin. On the one hand, you've got the government banning TikTok. And on the other, you've got the government saying that TikTok is essential to the future of Canadian culture and they're anxious for it to make mandated contributions to help support CanCon. Well, you can't, on the one hand, say this is a national security risk and you're banning it. And on the other hand, saying that it's a foundational element
Important.
to ensure that they pay for your culture. But yet that's what they do because what they want is
Yeah.
that, they want that cash. So let's fund film and TV production. Let's fund the news sector. And in some ways, they're more comfortable making these companies pay than they are actually taking on some of their bad behavior.
Fascinating, dude, because it leans into C-18, that payment, and then the privacy issue. And you're one of the world's foremost guys when it comes to privacy, internet privacy, copyright, et cetera, et cetera. So C-18. Now, C-11, by the way, is it going to pass? I know it went back to it obviously has. They just take the Senate stuff and they say, forget it. The CRTC is going to be regulating online content very, very soon, are they not?
They are. So, yeah, at this stage, the government's made it pretty clear that they're going to
Yeah.
pass this without that exception. It still will go back to the Senate. It at this stage seems incredibly unlikely that the Senate might push back. Usually, the Senate is willing to push back once to say, we think that this legislation can be improved. Here's our suggested improvements. The House decides, and then the Senate usually just says, fine. That it's very rare for the Senate to say, well, we're really not comfortable with this. We're going to send it back to you again. In theory, they could, but that seems unlikely. So yes, this is likely to become legislation, receive royal assent, at which time it will then go to the CRT. Well, a couple of things will happen. First, the government will issue a policy direction to the CRTC. So it's the CRTC that has to implement all of this. The government will provide them with a lot of the missing detail from the legislation. One of the things that was always striking was that it omits, frankly, a lot of the details. And the government's going to provide that in what they say is a policy direction. It should be noted the
After
policy
the bill
direction
goes through, they're going to provide the
after the bill.
details of the bill after the bill
That
goes
is
through. That's
that
hot.
is exactly what
That's
they're
nice.
going to do. So, for example, they say video games are not included in this. It doesn't say that in the legislation, but they're likely to issue in the policy direction that video games aren't part of it. They say that they will address some of the user content concerns so that they will tell the CRTC our intent is not to regulate user content with this. That said, CRTC is independent and policy directions are not binding in the same way that legislation is. They have to consider them, but they don't have to actually do precisely what the government says. That's why they're independent. And so they can issue this policy direction. It's not the same as fixing the legislation itself. And in fact, both the government and the CRTC always insist, I think rightly, they would say, listen, they make their decisions based on the evidence before them. And so if the evidence before them says that you ought to regulate podcasts, well, then it's quite possible that even if the government says we'd rather not regulate podcasts at this time, that they're still going to regulate podcasts because, well, the power is in the legislation and they've got to follow to the extent to which they can the evidence that is there. And so that actually creates this, I think, difficult scenario whereby the government says, we're not regulating individual users. But unless individual users show up in Gatineau to these hearings to essentially provide evidence to ensure that they're not regulated, there is a real risk that they will be regulated. I mean, they're simply not individual users, of course, are not well set up to take this on in the way that some of the big lobby groups would be. So it will head to the CRTC. It will take a year or two, I would think, for some of this to work out. It's
Mhm.
possible we'll get court challenges. It's possible we'll get a change of government and see some of this repealed. So it's still a fairly lengthy process to see it play out. But once this receives royal assent, it's very tough to make a law. It's even tougher to undo a law.
Yeah.
And so if this passes, it's going to be with us for a while.
Yeah, it is. And I guess my last thing would be, in terms of them having the ability to regulate online content, I can't help but get away from some of the debates that I saw online when Rebel News tried to talk to Justin Trudeau during one of those debates. And it's just kind of funny to me, where he's like, "You're not real. I'm not paying attention to you. I'm not doing any of that stuff." It seems to me like that's really part of the unspoken part of Bill C-11 is that there seems to be this concerted push, and it's not about Rebel News, but it's about news that isn't real, that is damaging to Canadians. And um, I kind of get that part of it. Like I understand that, to have the ability to say we're shutting you down, it has to start somewhere. And kind of, to me, that's where this starts. I don't like it as someone that puts out a podcast every day and has 96 of them in his network that might be regulated in terms of content. Like, it's impossible for us to keep up with, right? Like, it's just going to be very, very difficult. And as someone who values the ability to be able to do this job on an alternative source, for the government to go, oh, by the way, we're going to come over to that alternative source. Now we're going to put that in our purview. It's scary. Like, it's bothersome because it's almost like throughout the process, which you've documented. Highly encourage everybody to go to michaelgeist.ca, that you documented. It's like every step along the way, every time someone has brought up, like yourself, an expert, brought up an issue, they've been like, yeah, good, put it in the envelope, send it to us. We're still not going to care. You know what I mean?
Yeah. This has been a really discouraging process.
For you, has it?
Have to admit, and it's not, yeah, and yes, it's not surprise. Government had votes from the beginning, and I go into no shortage of these issues, figuring I'm going to lose. So I'm not surprised, not surprised that we're seeing this happen. But what is discouraging in this particular case is that this bill C-11 in particular, there's just things discouraging about both bills. And in the case of C-11, you really did have. Hopefully you
You're
can
good.
see me
I got
still.
you. I got you.
Okay.
Yep.
Many of whom, uh, you know, had never encountered their MP before, had certainly never appeared before a House of Commons committee or even taken the time to write on some of these issues. And at the end of the day, the message they got was that their voice didn't count. And
Mm.
that, I think, is just an awful message at a time when there is a great deal of cynicism about politics, when it is hard to get people to engage in policy debates and the like. And the message the government sent was, yeah, you showed up, but we're not really interested in what you have to say. And that's in striking contrast to any number of other groups who, frankly, don't even have to work that hard to get their issue before government, and the government works hard to find a way to be responsive. In this case, the podcasters, the YouTubers, the TikTokers just weren't viewed as important, and the government decided they didn't need to listen to what they had to say.
You mean they viewed them as loopholes? I love how you put that earlier in the conversation. We're human beings. We're trying to make a
Yep.
living. Everybody is. There are a lot of people who derive income for their families here, and they're about to get a rude awakening, not just when it comes to discoverability, but regulation as well. C-18. Where do you want to dive into this one? Because you put out a killer tweet thread today, because there is not just kingmaking going on. Meta has now decided they're not going to be, which is Facebook, they're going to get out of the news business in Canada. Google has said they're going to start suppressing news in Canada because, as we know, I think Meta laid off another 10,000 people yesterday, 11,000 people a month ago. There is an end to the money in these companies, and they're not willing to give Canada money for nothing and the other stuff for free. That's just ridiculous. So Bill C-18 explain that real quick and what they're trying to do in terms of making these tech stacks pay for the service that these companies have used to make money for many, 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 many years.
Yeah. So Bill C-18 is about getting Google and Facebook in particular to provide money to Canadian media companies. And it's all Canadian media companies. In fact,
Except for this one.
it's newspapers, but it's also radio stations, broadcasters. Even produce news. Frankly, you do way more news than, frankly, some of those that will be eligible for this. And it's modeled a bit on a system that was established in Australia. And the government will say, listen, all we want is for Google and Facebook or Meta to negotiate with these various players. And the way they do that is they say, we're going to force you to negotiate, because if you don't negotiate, we're going to create an arbitration system at the end where both sides will put forward the amount that they think is appropriate, and the arbitrator will have to choose one or the other. It's known as baseball style arbitration, where you have to pick what you think is the best offer. Now, they've stacked the arbitration process in such a way that it's fairly clear that they're going to side with the media proposal, which is really what provides increased pressure on Google and Facebook to negotiate something, because they don't want to end up in arbitration. But here's the catch. The amount of money that we're talking about is not trivial. Hundreds of millions of dollars, the majority of which would go to broadcasters, would go to Bell, go to Rogers, to go to CBC. They actually then, late in the process, added hundreds of additional broadcasters simply by virtue of the fact they have a license with the CRTC, not even required to produce news. In fact, we had one Senator Peter Harders, Liberal senator, say that government envisions that this could result in payments up to 35% of the news expenditures, and that would be of every news outlet in the country. We're just talking about massive amounts. But as the government itself acknowledges, the basic choice that these companies face is that if they link to this content, they have to pay. If they choose not to link, they don't. And had this legislation been just about, let's say Google or Facebook copies full text of articles and run ads against it, I think everybody would be lining up and say, yeah, sure, of course, that's something that makes sense to create a system to ensure that there's some fairness there. But that's not what we're talking about. Legislation says what they need to negotiate on isn't just copying the articles, it's anything known as facilitating access to the news. So that's indexing it, that's ranking it, and that is just linking to it. And so they're literally saying that the act of linking to this content, of sending a reader back to the original source where they see the publisher's advertising, is itself an act that requires compensation. Not compensation from the party that's actually getting the benefit of the link, which is the way you would usually think of this, but instead would require Facebook and Google to actually pay to refer the traffic on to these third-party sites. Which makes, I must say, makes no sense to anyone who knows anything about how the internet functions. In fact, these media companies at times will advertise their own articles on a site like Facebook to try to drive traffic to their site. So they're paying for those same links. And then on the other hand, the government is saying, well, if Facebook in their own, if let's say the National Post in their own Facebook posts, does a post with a link to one of their articles, Facebook somehow should be paying the National Post for that link. It's bizarre. And so the response, no surprise from the two companies, is to say, well, we may just opt out of news altogether. And so Google, somewhat infamously now, I believe it's actually ending today, they said the committee for 5 weeks tested the prospect for 4% of users not to include links in search results. And Facebook has said that they will stop news sharing on their platform in Canada, because they say, listen, it's about 3% of the platform. It doesn't generate all that much revenue for us. It doesn't change engagement very much. And the amount of money that you're talking about is crazy. And so they've put on the table that they will walk away from this. It's fair to say the government has not responded very well to this. They knew this was a possibility. They were asked about the possibility, and they seem to have just kind of gone along with the idea that, well, why would a company object or find some kind of response other than
it's like
compliance?
they just thought, of course Facebook and Google are going to pay us. Of course they got all the money, of course, and they owe us for some reason. They owe us for us using and building communities on their app, which they let us do, and us using them as a business strategy, making millions off them. They owe us for that, which is fascinating to me. But it's causing a new argument, a new issue. And you tweeted about that today, and I found this really, really fascinating. Is when Google and Meta basically said, hey, listen, as you pointed out, Google for the last 5 weeks has basically said we're going to suppress certain links and news to a few people in Canada and test it ahead of the acknowledgement that C-18 is going to prevent us from giving news to you because we can't afford it. We're not going to be paying that bill. We're not paying a reverse amount. So we're not minting people so that we can share their articles. They're using us. Why would they do that? It's ridiculous to me. But on top of it, the Canadian government said, oh yeah, well, watch us. Explain this to me, because this is a tweet you put out a couple of hours ago. The government's demand that more than 3 years of private third-party communications be turned over by Meta or Google to a Commons committee about any Canadian regulation is genuinely frightening. This is more than just retribution for objecting to link payments on C-18. You went on to go into your tweet thread, which is fascinating, highly regarded, that you go and follow Michael at mgeist on Twitter. There's value in investigating internet platforms for anti-competitive behavior or privacy violations. The Privacy Commissioner and the Competition Bureau are there to do it. But government committee hearings that sweep in thousands of Canadians' communications is wrong. Now, is that Pablo Rodriguez and the Liberal government saying, okay, listen, if you're not going to pay us, we're going to take you to court and we're going to make you very uncomfortable? Because that's not just an invasion of privacy. That is bullshit. What I saw there is illegal bullshit. And the government's basically saying, okay, we're just going to access people's private information. So send us every communication you had with anybody, any complaint you had about C-11, any complaint anybody sent you about C-18. Like literally, it's dictatorial, for a lack of a better term.
Yeah, honestly, I was shocked by it, I have to say. So, the government has not responded well, first to the Google test and then now to Facebook saying that they're not going to share news. And I mean, I guess no surprise by that. No surprise that that's the case. They clearly would be concerned. They clearly were hoping for, I don't know, I guess they were hoping these companies would say, sure, where do I write the check? But, the companies have, I think, unsurprisingly said that this is not something, at least Facebook has said they're not prepared to continue to share news. Google just did the test. They haven't really said what their final outcome would be. And so the government's response at this stage is to say that they're basically going to put them on trial, it feels, at committee. So it's not in court, it's at a parliamentary committee. They want at least 5 hearings where they want CEOs of the respective companies to show up. They want to devote 2 days to foreign experts to talk about how bad Google and Facebook are. And so there'll be a whole lot of complaining about those 2 companies. And I think there's scope to investigate those companies, complain about those companies. But amongst the things that they are demanding, it really is stunning. I mean, you just highlighted it. And so they want not just these people to show up, but from a document perspective, they want, for years now, any internal communication, any external communication regarding something like Bill C-18. In fact, any external documents, memos, communications with third parties with respect to about this issue, let's say about C-11, suddenly their correspondence is getting swooped in by the committee. A researcher conducting research into some of these issues, their communication is getting swooped in as part of this. It's so broad ranging. It could be a podcaster saying, I'm concerned what C-18 would mean. And suddenly your private communication is all fair game because it says all third-party communications is part of that. And it is such a stunning overreach. I don't think anybody really expects, well, maybe they do, but I'd be surprised if the companies comply. I think the Privacy Commissioner of Canada would have something to say about that as well. But the very idea that the government thinks that this is an appropriate response, this kind of retribution for the companies responding as they are entitled to respond under this legislation. I mean, you may hate it, but the reality is the government is the one that kind of set up this framework. And I find it astonishing to see this kind of overreach. It really does feel pretty McCarthy-esque. It's kind of like, have you ever had any association with these companies? And they're investigating the companies themselves. But if you're someone who has a relationship with the government or does get some grants or whatever, you just had some interest and you had a correspondence, you maybe don't want that private communication going to, frankly, a committee that hasn't really shown itself fit to do true investigative work and has been totally plagued by sort of just partisan nonsense that it frankly took the Senate to actually come up with the kind of more detailed hearings that were needed. And yet, that feels like where we're at right now with this proposal that I would expect the MPs, who seemingly have no shame at all, are basically, moving towards. Have you now or ever had any kind of correspondence with a web giant? Because they want to know.
That blows my mind. Like, as you sit and explain what the government, the Trudeau government, is trying to accomplish by forcing two tech behemoths, who, by the way, I have no love for either, in terms of what they've done to traditional media. But hey, listen, we all got to evolve. It is what it is. Google has a monopoly on advertising. Facebook has a monopoly on community groups. They got 5 billion people. They're a very wealthy company. They've legitimately abused the freedom of speech. And listen, we all have problems with individual platforms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not taking the side of big tech when I say this. I'm taking the side of the Canadian that sent a letter to Facebook about their concern about C-18 or C-11, or just sent a note to them, and then that note then becomes the property of the Canadian government, which they are willing to use in research or investigative issues, which no one has given permission to do. But they're saying that's what we want. We want all your private communications with all your people. That is, from my understanding, you would know better than me as a privacy expert. Is that not illegal? Like, are there not laws that prevent the government from not just overreaching, but overreaching to the point where they say, we want to put Canadians and their communications in jeopardy?
Well, listen, they would say the response, I'm sure, would be, no, we're not really. We're concerned about the companies themselves. And so that's why we're asking for this information. And we, as parliamentarians, have all these large powers, and including the entitlement to demand this kind of information. But, in doing so, they are sweeping in these in individuals in this way. They are trying to send a very strong message that anybody that cooperates, that works with, that talks to any of these companies somehow, raises somehow is doing wrong. And there's no doubt that we already live at a time where there is that kind of skepticism. There have been efforts, quite frankly, to suggest that anybody that would say anything critical of this legislation, the government says it all the time. They say, you're just taking the side of big tech. And I've done interviews where before going on, they say, well, we want to just clear. We just want to check this out. Are you taking any money from Google, or are you taking any money from Facebook? And the answer is no. I am not, have not. These are my legit opinions, and so I provide them to them, and that comes sometimes at a pretty significant personal cost, if I'm honest about it. But the fact that they seek to tar anybody that has these opinions in this way, when at the same time they say nothing about anyone that would be supportive of the legislation. They don't ask someone who supported this legislation, are you getting anything from News Media Canada or from Bell or from Rogers or Post Media? They welcome those opinions. In fact, at the committee, they were lining up people that they could find. They couldn't find that many from Canada, but they lined up all sorts of people from outside the country to say supportive things of the legislation. It's not just a double standard. It's a dangerous tarring of anybody who would dare to, frankly, criticize any sort of government legislation.
And I got to tell you, that's a pattern here with this government, is it not? The label factor, labeling people on behalf of whatever agenda they might have. I don't mean to get into other political arenas, and I'm not going to do it because it's not what we're talking about today. But generally speaking, that's how proponents of this legislation, without giving any benefit, have labeled you, have labeled other people, soft labels, hard labels that have anything to do with this. Tinfoil hats, you're just against Canadian content, which is fascinating to me because you're a Canadian content producer, right? You're a professor. You've got your doctorate. You understand where this stuff is coming from, and they ask you to speak on behalf of this. That's got to be discouraging. when they ask for your opinion, bring you in for it, and then go, we don't care either. We're just kind of playing the game here, just trying to figure it out. That's like you talked about these bills being discouraging. Has this process, and take politics out of this, has this process changed, or have you seen this process before play out? And how does it sit with you in terms of maybe a new landscape of overreach on behalf of this government? And here in Canada, I mean, freedom of speech and that freedom index that we all talk about, this is the opposite of that, the very opposite of that.
Yeah. No, well, listen, as I mentioned, I go in expecting a lot of times to lose on some of these issues, and I often do. And quite frankly, when it was the Harper government, I was very critical of a lot of things that the Harper government was doing as well. So I don't think it was a partisan issue. And at those days, there were liberals who were quite happy to quote what I had to say, because I was at that stage criticizing the Harper government, the conservative government. And that was a frustrating time too, to be sure. They had a majority, especially when they had a majority government. Majority governments do what they want. What makes this though particularly frustrating, I guess, is 2 points. One, candidly, I had higher expectations of this government. It ran on not being the Harper government, on being more open and transparent and all those kinds of things. And I feel that over the years that has increasingly indistinguishable, quite frankly, in terms of the way they do things. Still some differences in policy, but the process, some of that governance, and the politics, there really isn't any difference between the two at this point in time, which frankly I never would have thought back in 2015. But beyond that, when you get into some of these issues, I mean, maybe I'm just too much of an academic, but I get in thinking that, you're not going to win every argument. I get that politics is involved, but you also have, I guess, some amount of hope that there is at least still some ability to persuade, that there is ability to marshal evidence, to demonstrate a genuine problem or concern, and seek to identify a solution. I mean, that's supposed to be what policymaking is all about. And I think the experience coming out of what we've seen on digital policy lately from this government and this minister Rodriguez is that there isn't that scope, that there is not a genuine attempt to try to develop good policy. It's purely politically motivated, and too many voices don't count. And I think that's really unhealthy.
Well, the landscape's going to change, and listen, I appreciate you talking about it in terms of, there's personal effect here for people that are trying to do the work of informing others about what's going on, because we don't really live in a society here in Canada where, the press does a great job of this, and the press stands to, specifically mainstream media in this country, stands to benefit financially greatly. So, we're not seeing these conversations in op-eds. We're not seeing these in, the Toronto Star podcast or whatever terrible podcast newspaper guys do in this country, because they stand to benefit to the tune of billions and billions and billions of dollars. And so what they don't want to do is get in the way of the government's full court press of big tech and you and me, right? And I always look at like who stands to benefit, right? Because as you and I have talked and have several conversations about this over the past year, you look at the people who will be hurt or marginalized by it, and it's us. It's us. It's the vast majority of Canadians who just want to do shit. They just want to create. They just want to be part of an ecosystem. They're just here. We stand to lose. All of us stand to lose. You know who stands to benefit the most are mainstream media outlets, government officials that have relationships with those mainstream media outlets. And that in itself tells the story, does it not? Or part of the story, which is like, hey, traditional media failed. They need money back because Google and AdSense took over the world, and Facebook is the number one purveyor of news, which, by the way, not unhappy that Facebook is going to shut off the news feature in Canada. We're going to have a bunch of smarter people out west. But my point is this, is that, we really do live in that world where it's like, hey, the benefit and the person at the end of that benefit, that's who you have to go after. That's who we have to figure out. That's what we have to understand, is why are they doing this? And there's like this entire bribe vibe that I get from this for mainstream media and certain political opportunities and their relationships, which is the emotional part of this for me, right? Because, we look at the bills and you can break them down and you can talk about individually what it means to people on TikTok and YouTube and stuff like that. But there is a legitimate, king making process specifically involved in C-18 that is very hand in hand with the executive relationships in the political institutions and in our media institutions, is there not?
There is, and I mean, you're right to highlight both, who the winners are with this, and how that has influenced coverage of these issues. I must admit, I've often been a bit of a skeptic when people talk about the bias in the media. That's not to say that there isn't bias in the media. I recognize that, of course, everyone comes in with some amount of bias and perspective, but this, especially C-18, has highlighted in just such an obvious way how the business self-interest of certain large media companies has a direct impact on the kind of coverage that we see. I don't know that it has an impact on the day-to-day reporters. I think reporters do their jobs and try to play it as straight as they can. But the editorial function, the way that stuff is presented, unquestionably has an impact. I mean, you mentioned the post media when we were talking about C-11 and how they're happy to criticize the government, but not on C-18. Take a look at the coverage of post media's coverage on C-18, and you will find op-ed after op-ed supportive of the legislation.
It's so great.
You will find You will find columnists like Brian Lilly, like Warren Kinsella, who write for those papers, who criticize the government on lots of different things, but not on C-18. They're all in on C-18. And so you can't tell me that that is not somehow this blurring of business and editorial, and it has a direct impact. And the irony behind all of this is that the government trumpets this legislation as safeguarding our media and the independence of the media. And yet I'd be hard pressed to think of many things that have had a bigger influence, at least on this issue, in terms of the kind of coverage that you get, than legislation that is of the direct vested interest of the media itself.
And you know what? We'll end there, but just to kind of put a bow on it, not that I can because you're much smarter than me. I love having smart people on this show. But you think about what happens in terms of the benefitors, if that's even a word, right? And then you consider where we're at in terms of how we figure out how to go forward as people that legitimately, like, there's going to be a process now where we have to figure this out as content people. What we're all going to be subject to rules and regulations that we don't want, we don't like, et cetera, et cetera. But where C-18 really comes to life for me is that there are people involved in this that know exactly what's at stake. They know exactly how much money they're going to get to the penny, right? And they know exactly how they're going to spend it. And they know that this is going to shut out people that are not licensed or part of that CRTC regulation. So in a way, it's not protecting Canadian content. It's protecting the purveyors and the traditional folks that own Canadian content in this country. So it's basically like locking Canadians into this information bubble where the kingmakers get to decide how things work, and they get to do it with other people's money, and they get the added advantage of getting a 20-meter head start in a 30-meter race when it comes to doing business in this space. Because I look at it from an enterprise perspective, right? We're a podcast network, we're a blog and news network, we're a sports network, we're a collective of different people that do this, over 200 people in this network that do this, that we monetize for and amplify for. Now I'm thinking, okay, it's not just my brand. We've got 200 other brands we got to help figure out that are not going to get that net benefit that those guys are. So we're even further behind than everybody else.
Yeah, no, I think you make a great point. Absolutely. That's where we are at. It's pretty clear who the beneficiaries are coming out of this, and who the losers are. And I would just even one last bit on C-18. It's always struck me that best case for the Bells and Rogers and Post Medias of the world is to get lots and lots of Google money. Next best is that nobody gets money and that nobody gets the links, because if you're a well-established player, yes, you may take a bit of a hit, but you're still got a lot of people who know where to find you and do out of habit. But if you're a startup, if you're a new podcast network, or if you're starting up a local online news source, search and social is a core part of your business plan because it's the only way you're going to build an audience. And if the outcome of C-18 is that is lost, if you're sitting there as a post media concerned with the kind of those new innovative startups that are nipping at your heels, it's a second best outcome. Not as good as getting lots of cash, but not that bad either if you wipe out the competition.
And they're getting both. Unbelievable. And Dr. Geist, thanks, dude. Really appreciate you doing this. Always great to talk to you. Thanks for informing me and having this conversation. I've been light on the C-18, C-11 stuff because there's part of me that sees an off-ramp in this post-truth society, because that's important to me, that we're accountable with our content, even though we like to have fun and entertain people. And I know disinformation, misinformation, gaslighting is an issue, but there are so many layers to this, and the disrespect that this government is showing Canadians, the disrespect that the Liberal government has been shoveling onto experts like yourself over the past year and a half, has been truly shocking to me. And I wanted to lay this out for people, and I greatly appreciate you doing this. And I hope you get more physio for your neck and you get out of that chair a little bit more. You too.
Sounds good. All righty. Thanks so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Great to talk to you. We'll talk to you soon. Dr. Michael Geist, professor at Ottawa University. That's the guy. That's the guy that has all the goods on C-18 and C-11. Listen, you cannot trust this government. You can't trust any government. This isn't a culture piece. I'm not doing this because I hate Trudeau or I hate the Liberals or I love Pierre Poilievre or I like conservatives. Fuck it all. Fuck it all. You're the person that's going to lose. Got a TikTok account? Guess what? The government can take it away as soon as C-11 passes. They can. You got a podcast, a couple hundred people, grandma likes it. That can be regulated. Everything you do can be regulated. Everything you say and see can be regulated by this government. I know they like to put on this like brave face of how they're here for all Canadians. This is the biggest fuck you to all of you. 35 million of you with a fucking cell phone by this government. I have no love for these cats at all. Zero. And it's not because I have a vested interest because we have a podcast network and a news network. It's because to get to this point has been the biggest struggle of anybody's life that has achieved any kind of critical mass when it comes to a digital product, digital content, right? Follow with me. This is good. The government is going to change the rules. And they're going to say, oh, yeah, by the way, those people, Bell, Chorus, Rogers, Stingray, those guys, we're going to make them the arbiters of how this whole fucking thing works because we want to get reelected again. And those people have the most influence in this country. That's what it comes down to. Influence and influence peddling. The government is trying to make Google, Facebook, and other apps, which, by the way, are not going to do it. They're trying to force them to pay Bell, Rogers, blah, 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 Star, Post, Sun, all that shit. Trying to pay them for fucking you for the past 100 years. Because not only they fuck you, they fucked themselves and they decided they didn't want to have a great digital plan when the internet was invented 40 fucking years ago. Oh, we're just going to keep driving this home. That's what they do. And so now the government's trying to play catch up. And this Liberal government is playing catch up by saying, oh, by the way, we'll give you some dental health care. We'll give you, I don't know, maybe a couple $100 for some subsidies. We'll do something nice. But we're going to fuck you when it comes to your freedom of online speech. And here's the other thing. We're going to give the media in this country, which is all compromised, any media outlet that gets a government subsidy, absolutely fucking 100% compromised. They're lying to you for that money. All of them. Doesn't stop. It doesn't stop with like, oh, we gave them like a little subsidy or we gave them a tax write-up. No, they get hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Your newspaper, so they're relying on that. So they'll do whatever the government says. That's called being fucking compromised. CTV is a state outlet. Depending on who that executive relationship is attached to the state. CTV, CBC, they're all subsidized by the government. And they're about to be fucking minted by the government to the point where they get to decide all the rules and you get to eat shit. It's exciting, isn't it? Thanks to Dr. Geist for being on. Really appreciate it. Make sure you go to michaelgeist.ca. His podcast, Law Bites, very educational, dude. It's cool to be smart. That guy's cool because he's really smart, way smarter than me, but you already knew that. Anyway, appreciate Dr. Geist for being on the show. Thanks so much. And thanks to our friends and partners for making this possible. Or go to cantork.com today. Canada's assembly tool experts are standing by to make you a tool that you can't buy or get anywhere else for industries that are hard to buy for, hard to fabricate for: nuclear, railroad, oil sands. Doesn't matter if it's heavy equipment. If you have a loosening or fastening project, these guys have your solution. Service, rentals, calibration, fabrication from scratch. Canadian manufacturers of the best torque wrenches on the planet, and they're in Canada, and they do it across the world. So if you have an application that you need, no matter the scale of your bolting project, they have your solution. Go to cantork.com today for more information. Don't forget our friends at kivlaw.ca. These are great lawyers that have the ability to not only get you out of trouble, keep you free, get your life back as well. If you're looking for top criminal defense attorneys in Southern Ontario, kivlaw.ca. Kivlaw defense lawyers will keep you out of trouble, give you legal help 24/7, get honest answers, and get you the defense that you absolutely deserve. So don't go through your legal issue together on your own. Go through it with our friends over at kivlaw.ca. Email the principal over there today, robert@kivlaw.ca. robert@kivlaw.ca. Honest answers about your situation from an experienced defense lawyer and his team that know they are there for you and how to fight for your freedom. So make sure you get a hold of my man Rob if you got a legal issue. Also, thanks to our friends at Ed's Fine Imports. His gits are the ones that we wear. Luxury brand of boxer briefs. You can't mess with these things. Seriously, I got like 6 new pair yesterday. Yeah, yesterday I went 6 new pair of underwear. Same colors: purple, orange, black. I like the black ones. Don't mind the red ones either. I was shocked that I liked red underwear. I always thought that was kind of fancy. Everybody's got colors. I'm just a black guy. Plus, black is pure camouflage just in case something happens. But Ed's got your underwear, luxury boxer briefs, huge pouch in the front. We're Canadian. And great waistband, super breathable. You'll love them. Go to edsfineimports.com. GITCH3 is your promo code. You get a free pair of underwear when you buy 3 or more when you check out. So check that out today. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you being here. We'll be back tomorrow on this very program. Jesse Miller, social media educator. We'll have a little TED talk with him about, TikTok, don't stop till you drop. In a post-truth world. I love those words. Post-truth world. That's where we live. And we'll have some fun, too. We'll talk about Danny Briere, and we'll recover The Last of Us. I don't know if you saw The Last of Us final episode. Maybe the best show I've ever watched on television. You guys see The Last of Us? Locke's going to be here tomorrow. We'll talk about The Last of Us because he listens to the podcast. Then he comes in and he starts talking about what he heard on the podcast like he just came up with it himself. It's my favorite thing in the world. Anyway, we'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody. Really appreciate you being here. Don't forget to tip your waiter. Bye.